The sun of the New Mexico territory beat down hard upon the dry earth, cracking the soil and turning the once fertile land into a patchwork of dust and brittle grass. Life was never easy out here, but for Samuel Carter, it had become nearly unbearable. A man in his mid-30s, Samuel had inherited a small ranch from his father, a patch of land that barely stretched across the horizon. Once, his father's cattle had thrived here, grazing on rolling fields of tall grass. But times had changed. Droughts, debt, and hard winters had stripped away not just the land's abundance, but also Samuel's spirit. Each morning, Samuel rose before dawn, not because hope stirred him, but because necessity demanded it. He patched broken fences with rotting wood, carried buckets of water for the few cattle he had left, and battled the endless dust storms that swept across the plains. The barn, once strong and proud, leaned to one side as if it too had given up. His hands were cracked and calloused, evidence of years of labor that yielded little reward. In town, Samuel's reputation was that of a decent but unfortunate man. Shopkeepers allowed him credit, though whispers followed him wherever he went. "Carter's barely holding on," some would mutter. Others wondered aloud how long before the bank claimed his ranch. He ignored the gossip, but deep down he knew they were right. His debts grew heavier each month, and with cattle prices dropping, he had little chance of catching up. What Samuel lacked in wealth, however, he carried in heart. He had always been known for his kindness, the sort of man who would lend his last loaf of bread to a neighbor or mend someone else's fence before his own. Yet kindness didn't pay bills, and it certainly didn't bring rain to dry land. Nights were the hardest. He sat alone in his creaking wooden house, staring at the empty chair across the table. His wife, Clara, had passed years earlier from fever, leaving him with a ranch to run and a heart heavy with grief. Some nights he prayed, asking the Lord for a sign, some reason to keep pushing forward when each day seemed bleaker than the last. The loneliness pressed on him like a physical weight. With no children and no kin nearby, Samuel often wondered what purpose his life served. His only companions were his cattle, his faithful dog Buck, and the endless, unforgiving land. Yet despite the hardships, there was still a flicker of determination in him, a stubbornness born of the frontier. He had promised his father he would never abandon the land, no matter how cruel the years became. One hot afternoon, while riding the edges of his ranch to check the water troughs, Samuel paused at the ridge overlooking the valley. His herd, though small, moved sluggishly under the sun, their ribs visible through their hides. He sighed, adjusting the brim of his worn hat. The ranch was slipping from his hands, and he knew it. But surrender wasn't in his nature. Still, Samuel could not have imagined how quickly fate would change. The wide, empty plains he thought he knew so well were about to bring him face to face with a test greater than debt, drought, or loneliness. Something stirred out there in the wild, a chance encounter that would pull him into a world of danger, loyalty, and unexpected bonds. For now, he was just a struggling rancher clinging to hope. But soon, his life and the life of an entire Apache band would intertwine in ways that would leave the town whispering his name for generations. The next morning broke in silence, save for the lonely call of a crow overhead. Samuel saddled his weary horse, Dusty, and rode out across the range to check the far edge of his land. The sky was a wide, merciless blue, stretching endlessly above the desert plains. The wind carried no relief, only the sharp sting of grit against his face. He rode slow, his eyes scanning the horizon for strays or signs of coyotes. Buck, his loyal dog, trotted at the horse's heels, tongue lolling in the heat. Samuel had long ago learned to read the land, the faint tracks in the dirt, the tilt of a broken branch, the whisper of movement in tall grass. But that morning something felt different. The silence was too heavy, the air thick with an unease he couldn't quite name. As he approached a narrow arroyo where mesquite trees grew tangled and stubborn, Dusty's ears pricked forward. The horse snorted, uneasy. Buck growled low in his throat. Samuel pulled on the reins, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows cast by the rocks. That's when he saw it, a movement, slight but undeniable. His hand went instinctively to the worn revolver on his hip, though he hesitated to draw. The shape shifted again, and he caught a glimpse of cloth against the earth. Faded buckskin, streaked with dust and blood. Cautiously, Samuel dismounted, tying Dusty to a scrubby tree. He moved forward, every step measured, his boots crunching softly on gravel. Buck patted ahead, sniffing, then stopped and looked back at him with ears flat and tail stiff. Behind a cluster of rocks, he found them. Two young women lay huddled close together, their dark hair tangled, their faces pale with exhaustion. They were Apache. He knew it instantly from their clothing and beaded necklaces. One clutched a crude knife, though her hand trembled too much to raise it. The other's leg was badly wounded, blood seeping through a hastily tied strip of cloth. Their wide eyes fixed on Samuel, filled with fear and defiance. Samuel froze. He knew the danger in this. To be found aiding Apaches could ruin him in the eyes of the town, or worse, draw the wrath of their people if he made the wrong move. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said gently, his voice steady, though his heart thudded hard. "I ain't here to hurt you." The older of the two sisters tried to speak, but coughed instead, her voice hoarse with thirst. The younger tightened her grip on the knife, her dark eyes flashing with distrust. Samuel could see they were at the end of their strength. Whatever had brought them here, be it raiders, soldiers, or some misfortune, they wouldn't survive long without help. For a moment, he wrestled with the choice. If he walked away, no one would know. If he helped, he risked everything. The little land he still held, his fragile place in the community, even his life. Yet, as he looked at them, two sisters clinging to one another, battered and desperate, he felt a pang deep in his chest. He knew that kind of struggle, that fight just to keep going one more day. Buck whined softly, breaking the silence. Samuel crouched, lowering himself to their level. "You need water," he said softly. "Let me help." The knife wavered, then lowered slightly. The wounded sister's eyes fluttered closed, and Samuel knew she couldn't hold on much longer. Without waiting for permission, he reached into his canteen and held it out. The younger one hesitated, then snatched it, lifting it carefully to her sister's lips. The water spilled, but enough made it down to bring life back into her parched throat. In that moment, the decision was made. Samuel Carter, the struggling rancher, had stepped into a storm far greater than his debts or his failing land. He didn't know it yet, but by choosing compassion over fear, he had set events in motion that would shake the borderlands and change his life forever. Samuel knelt in the shade of the rocks, watching the two Apache sisters with cautious eyes. He could feel their distrust as clearly as the heat radiating from the desert floor. The younger one, no more than 19, kept the knife clutched tight in her hand, her knuckles pale from the strain. The older sister, weak from blood loss, leaned heavily against her sibling, her breathing shallow and uneven. Samuel's mind raced. Every lesson of survival he'd ever learned screamed at him to walk away. Harboring Apaches was not just dangerous, it was reckless. Out here, lines were drawn sharp between settlers and tribes. Even if the sisters posed no threat, the town would never see it that way. A single rumor could brand him a traitor or worse. Men had been run off or strung up for far less. But then his gaze settled on the wounded girl's face. She looked barely older than Clara had been when fever took her. Samuel's chest tightened. He remembered the helplessness of watching someone you loved fade before your eyes, powerless to change the outcome. Could he really turn his back now when these young women had no one else? He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, weighing his choices. On one hand was safety, the chance to ride away, keep to himself, and avoid trouble. On the other was humanity, an act of kindness that could cost him everything. The younger sister's voice broke the silence. Her words were in Apache, harsh and quick, but the meaning was plain enough. She was warning him off, ready to fight if he came closer. Samuel didn't flinch. He had no desire to fight, no interest in dominance. What he saw before him weren't enemies. They were survivors, clinging to each other in a land that gave no mercy. "Listen," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I don't want trouble. But your sister, she won't make it through the night out here." The girl's dark eyes studied him, torn between suspicion and desperation. Her hand trembled on the knife. Samuel waited, letting the silence stretch, giving her time to see he wasn't lying. Finally, the knife dipped. Only slightly, but enough. Samuel took a steadying breath. The choice was made. He would help them. All right, he said quietly. Let's get her up. My place ain't far. The younger one blinked, uncertain. But when her sister sagged further, nearly collapsing, she gave a sharp nod. Together, with careful movements, Samuel lifted the wounded girl into his arms. She was light as a feather, far too light for someone her age. He felt the heat of fever radiating from her skin, her head lolling against his shoulder. Carrying her to Dusty, he secured her gently across the saddle, while the younger sister mounted behind to hold her steady. Buck barked once as if urging them to move quickly. Samuel swung up onto the saddle behind them, the weight of his decision pressing heavier than the girl in his arms. As they started back toward the ranch, Samuel's thoughts churned. If anyone from town saw him, there would be questions he couldn't answer. And if the Apache warriors came searching and found their women in his care, well, the outcome could be worse than anything the bank or townsfolk could do. Yet for all the danger, there was a strange calm in him, too. For the first time in months, maybe years, Samuel felt he had purpose again. Not the endless grind of debt and dust, but something real, something worth the risk. He glanced back at the two sisters. The younger held her sister tightly, whispering words of comfort in a language Samuel didn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. The rancher knew he had crossed a line he could never step back from. His life, once dictated by drought and despair, was now tethered to theirs. Whatever storm awaited them, he would face it head-on. Samuel Carter had made his choice, and in the unforgiving land of the frontier, that choice would soon demand a price. By the time Samuel reached his ranch, the sun was low, spilling gold and crimson across the horizon. Dusty was lathered with sweat, and Samuel himself felt the exhaustion settle deep in his bones. Yet he wasted no time. He carried the wounded sister into the small, weather-worn cabin that had once been filled with Clara's laughter. Now it was silent, save for the creak of old wood and the rasp of the girl's unsteady breath. He laid her gently on his narrow bed, the only one he owned. The younger sister hovered close, her eyes darting around the cabin, wary of every movement Samuel made. She held tight to the knife, though her grip looked weaker than it had out on the range. Samuel crouched beside the bed, studying the wound on the older sister's leg. The crude binding she'd tied had slowed the bleeding, but infection was already setting in. The skin was hot, angry, swollen. He muttered under his breath. This was beyond his skill, but leaving it untreated meant certain death. "Stay with me now," he said softly, though he knew she likely couldn't understand. He pulled a small tin box from under the shelf, the closest thing he had to medicine. Inside were scraps of cloth, a dull needle, some whiskey, and a few herbs Clara had once insisted on keeping for fevers. Samuel set to work with steady hands, cleaning the wound as best he could. The girl moaned, thrashing weakly as the whiskey burned through raw flesh. Samuel held her down gently but firmly. The younger sister murmured words in Apache, her voice sharp at first, then soft, like a lullaby. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Comfort, courage, love. Hours slipped by in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the girl's ragged breathing. When he finally tied the fresh bandage in place, Samuel sat back with a weary sigh. Sweat clung to his brow, his hands sticky with blood and whiskey. The younger sister looked at him then, really looked at him. Her eyes, still wary, held a flicker of something else now. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. She saw the effort he'd given, the risk he'd taken. For the first time since they met, she lowered the knife to her lap. Samuel nodded once, respectful, as though they had struck an unspoken truce. He rose, filled a tin cup with water, and handed it to her. She accepted it hesitantly, then pressed it to her sister's lips. A few drops dribbled down her chin, but some found their way in. The wounded girl stirred, murmuring weakly before slipping back into sleep. That night, Samuel sat in the old wooden chair by the hearth. Buck curled at his feet and kept watch. His thoughts churned with the weight of what he'd done. The town was close enough that if anyone dropped by, explanations would be demanded. And if Apache scouts found their women here, would they believe his intentions? Or would his cabin be burned? His blood spilled on the dirt floor where Clara once walked. Still, as he listened to the faint breathing of the two sisters, Samuel felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of worth. Helping them had stirred something long dormant inside him, a reminder that life wasn't only about debts and drought, but about choices. Hard choices, right choices. By dawn, the wounded sister's fever had not broken, but she was alive. The younger sat awake, still clutching the knife loosely, her eyes red from sleeplessness. Samuel met her gaze and said quietly, "She's strong. She'll pull through." He doubted she understood his words, but the calmness in his tone seemed to reach her. She blinked slowly, then turned back to her sister. Outside, the first rays of light broke over the barren land, bathing the ranch in gold. A new day had come, but Samuel knew it brought danger closer. He had taken in 2 Apache sisters when most men would have walked away. Now, the question wasn't whether he could keep them alive. It was how long before the world came knocking on his door. For the next 3 days, the ranch became a place of quiet struggle and slow healing. Samuel tended to his cattle by day, mended fences, hauled water, and chopped wood, but each evening his steps carried him back to the cabin where the 2 Apache sisters remained. The older one, whom he had learned was named Nayeli, fought fever and weakness, but each time Samuel checked her wound, he saw a little more strength return. The younger sister, called Ahyoka, never left her side, watching Samuel with eyes sharp as an eagle's, protective as a mother wolf. At first, their communication was nothing more than gestures, frowns, or hesitant nods. Ahyoka spoke little English, and Samuel knew only a few Apache words he'd picked up in trading posts. Yet somehow they managed. A pointed hand meant water, a shake of the head meant no, and a quiet glance held more meaning than sentences could. On the 4th evening, as Samuel replaced Nayeli's bandages, she stirred and opened her eyes fully for the first time since he'd brought her in. Her gaze, dark and piercing despite the fever, fixed on Samuel. She whispered something weakly in Apache. Ahyoka leaned close, listening, then turned toward Samuel and said in halting English, "She say, you save her." Samuel paused, startled by the words. He dipped his head humbly. Any man would have done the same, but Ahyoka shook her head firmly. "No, others. Leave, or kill." Her broken words were heavy with truth. She pressed a hand to her chest, then touched her sister's arm. "We remember." It was the first moment Samuel felt the barrier between them crack. For days, suspicion had been in every glance, every movement. Now there was a glimmer of trust, fragile but real. That night, Samuel shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread with the sisters. They sat cross-legged on the floor, wary but willing, while Buck lay close by, his tail thumping whenever Ahyoka dropped crumbs his way. Samuel watched as Ahyoka tried cornbread for the first time, her expression softening with cautious approval. She murmured something in Apache to Nayeli, and for the first time since their arrival the sisters laughed, quietly, but enough to fill the lonely cabin with warmth Samuel hadn't felt in years. It struck him then how empty his home had been since Clara's passing. For so long, silence had been his only company. Now there were voices, laughter, even the sound of another's footsteps across the floorboards. It stirred something in him, something he had buried under the weight of hardship. In the days that followed, Ahyoka began helping with small chores. She swept the floor with the old broom, gathered kindling for the fire, and even attempted to draw water from the well, though Samuel quickly insisted on carrying the heavy bucket himself. She watched him work the ranch with sharp curiosity, as though studying his every move. Sometimes she tried mimicking his words in English, repeating them softly until she got them right. Samuel, in turn, asked her to teach him Apache words, and though her patience was thin, she obliged. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in firelight, Nayeli managed to sit up with Ahyoka's help. Samuel offered her a cup of broth. Her hand trembled as she took it, but she met his gaze steadily. She whispered something, her voice rough but clear. Ayoka translated softly. She say, "You good man." The words caught Samuel off guard. Praise was rare in his world. Most folks only ever measured him by his debts or his failures. To hear it from someone who owed him nothing, someone whose people had every reason to distrust men like him, it meant more than he could say. He tipped his hat low, hiding the heat in his cheeks. "Just doing what I can." As the sisters settled in for the night, Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Something had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. A bond had been forged, delicate, unlikely, but real. Gratitude had turned suspicion into trust, and trust into a fragile sense of belonging. For Samuel, who had spent so many nights alone in silence, that bond was worth more than all the cattle in the world. But he also knew bonds came with consequences, and out on the frontier, kindness rarely went unnoticed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, others would learn of this bond, and their reaction would decide the rancher's fate. The little town of Dry Creek lay 10 dusty miles from Samuel Carter's ranch, a cluster of wooden buildings that leaned against the endless plains like tired old men. It was where Samuel bought feed when he could, where he bartered hides and cattle, and where gossip flowed thicker than whiskey at the saloon. On a hot afternoon, a week after he had brought the sisters into his home, Samuel rode into town with Dusty, Buck trailing at his side. He needed flour, salt, and kerosene, simple supplies he couldn't do without. He also knew, though, that his absence from town hadn't gone unnoticed. Folks always talked when a man disappeared longer than usual. Sure enough, the stares started the moment he tied Dusty outside of Jensen's general store. Old Pete Miller, who whittled on the porch most days, squinted over his spectacles. "Carter," he muttered, voice low but sharp enough to carry. "Ain't seen much of you lately." Samuel tipped his hat, keeping his reply short. "Been busy with the ranch." Inside, the general store smelled of grain and old wood. Mrs. Jensen, a plump woman with sharp eyes, gathered the items Samuel requested. As she weighed out flour, she leaned closer. "Sam, some of the boys been saying they seen smoke from your place night and day. More than usual. You got company?" Samuel felt the question like a nail driven into his boot. He kept his face steady, though his heart beat faster. "Just keeping warm at night, ma'am. You know how cold them desert winds get." Mrs. Jensen didn't press, but the look in her eye said she didn't buy it. When Samuel stepped back outside with his supplies, a group of men stood nearby, talking low. He caught fragments of their words. "Strange tracks. Not cattle. Women, maybe?" Another voice. "Don't trust him. Man's desperate enough to try anything." Samuel mounted Dusty without comment, though he felt their eyes burning into his back as he rode out. He had always been the subject of whispers, the poor rancher, the unlucky widower, but this was different. These whispers had teeth. Back at the ranch, Samuel unloaded his supplies under the watchful gaze of Ayoka, who stood near the doorway with her arms crossed. She didn't need translation to understand his mood. His jaw was tight, his movements rougher than usual. "They're talking," Samuel muttered more to himself than to her. "Talking and watching." Ayoka tilted her head, uncertain. But when Samuel mimed eyes peering and mouths chattering, she seemed to understand. Her expression hardened. She whispered something in Apache to Nayeli, who lay resting. Nayeli's dark eyes flickered with unease, and she reached for her sister's hand. That evening, as the three of them shared a silent meal, Samuel's mind churned. The townsfolk's curiosity wouldn't die down. It would grow, like fire fed by wind. And sooner or later, someone might ride out to see for themselves. It wasn't just the townsfolk he feared. Apache scouts could be roaming nearby, searching for their missing sisters. If they found them here, would they believe Samuel had helped, or would they see him as a captor? As the night deepened and coyotes howled in the distance, Samuel sat on the porch, rifle across his lap. The sisters slept inside, Buck curled at their feet. He stared into the dark horizon, every shadow looking like a rider, every rustle like a boot on gravel. The whispers in town had begun, and whispers, Samuel knew, had a way of turning into storms. The morning came with a strange stillness, the kind of silence that made the hairs rise on Samuel's neck. Even Buck, usually eager to bark at the sunrise, paced the porch with low growls rumbling in his chest. Samuel stepped outside, the weight of unease pressing heavy on his shoulders. The sky was wide and pale, a curtain of dust hanging far out on the horizon. At first he thought it was another storm, but as the haze drew nearer, he saw the truth. Riders. A line of Apache horsemen crested the ridge, their figures stark against the rising sun. The glint of spears and rifles flashed in the morning light. Samuel's gut clenched. He counted at least 20 men, and at their head rode a tall figure draped in eagle feathers and leather armor, marked with beadwork. The man's posture was straight, his expression unreadable. There was no mistaking him. This was their chief. Samuel swallowed hard. He had known this day would come. Still, seeing them thundering across the plain toward his ranch made the reality almost unbearable. His hand twitched toward the rifle leaning by the door, but he didn't pick it up. A single shot would doom him. He wasn't facing outlaws or rustlers. He was facing a nation's wrath. A Hyoka appeared at the doorway behind him, her face pale but her eyes steady. She said one word, her voice low and firm. "Father." Samuel stiffened. So this was the sister's father, the man who would decide his fate. The riders slowed as they neared the ranch, dust swirling around them like a shroud. The chief raised a hand, and the warriors pulled their mounts to a halt, their eyes burning holes into Samuel. Spears gleamed, rifles rested in firm grips. The silence was heavy, broken only by the restless snort of horses. The chief dismounted with the grace of a man who carried the weight of many battles. He strode forward, his gaze sweeping over Samuel, the cabin, and finally the sisters who now stood in the doorway. Hyoka rushed to him, speaking quickly in Apache, her words spilling like water. Nayeli, still weak, leaned against the doorframe but managed to nod toward Samuel. Samuel's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't understand the words, but he felt the weight of them, the urgency in Hyoka's voice, the gratitude in Nayeli's trembling gestures. The chief listened in silence, his expression carved from stone. Then, slowly, his eyes turned to Samuel. The world seemed to shrink to that single moment. The rancher and the chief, two men bound by choices neither had wanted to make. Samuel tipped his hat, his voice rough. "I did what I could. That's all." The chief said nothing at first. Instead, he walked past Samuel into the cabin where he saw the makeshift bandages, the empty broth bowls, the signs of care and effort. He touched his daughter's forehead gently, his stern features softening just slightly. Then he turned back outside. The warriors shifted uneasily, waiting for his command. Samuel braced himself for the worst. Would they torch the cabin? Drag him out and leave his body in the dust? The thought of it made his palms slick with sweat, but he stood tall, refusing to flinch. Finally, the chief spoke. His words were deep, measured, and though Samuel couldn't understand them, Hyoka translated haltingly, "My father say, you did not take, you give. You not enemy." The chief's gaze remained fixed on Samuel, unreadable but fierce. Then he added something else, his voice like thunder rolling across the plains. Hyoka's eyes widened at the words before she translated. He say, "Tomorrow all will know his decision." The chief mounted his horse, the warriors following. With a single command, they turned and rode off, dust swallowing their retreat as quickly as it had announced their arrival. Samuel stood frozen on the porch, his heart pounding. The sisters clung to one another, relief etched on their faces. But for Samuel, relief was fleeting. The chief's words echoed in his mind. Tomorrow. A decision. And whatever that decision was, it would change everything. Word traveled faster than the wind across the plains. By the following morning, the people of Dry Creek knew Apache riders had come to Samuel Carter's ranch. Rumors spread in every direction. Some swore Samuel had kidnapped 2 Apache women. Others claimed he was trading secrets with the tribe. A few whispered he had joined forces with them, preparing to turn against his own kind. Fear has a way of making men reckless. By midday, a group of townsfolk rode out toward Samuel's ranch, armed with rifles, shotguns, and suspicion. At their head was Sheriff Tom Randall, a broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw who had once been Samuel's friend. Now his eyes burned with doubt. Samuel stood on the porch as the riders approached, the sisters behind him in the doorway. Buck growled low, sensing the tension that crackled like lightning in the air. Samuel's rifle rested near the door, but he kept his hands empty and visible. "Carter!" the sheriff called out, reining in his horse. "We heard you've been harboring Indians." "You know damn well what kind of trouble that brings." Samuel's voice was steady, though his heart thundered. They were hurt. "I couldn't leave them to die." Murmurs rippled through the group of men. Some scoffed, others spat into the dirt. One farmer raised his rifle slightly. "And what do you think happens when their people come riding in here? You'll bring hell down on all of us." Before Samuel could reply, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from the ridge. Dust rose again on the horizon, and out of it came the Apache riders, twice as many as the day before. They moved in silence, their faces painted, their weapons gleaming in the sun. At their head rode the chief. The townsfolk stiffened, guns raised. Horses pawed nervously at the ground, caught between fear and fury. Samuel stepped off the porch, lifting his hands. "Easy now," he called to the townsfolk, then turned to the Apache. "No one wants blood here." But the air was thick with the scent of it. The Apache warriors fanned out, circling the ranch, their eyes cold and unblinking. The townsfolk, outnumbered but cornered by pride, held their weapons tighter. Sheriff Randall barked, "Sam, step aside! This ain't your fight anymore." But it was. It had been since the moment Samuel lifted Nayeli from the arroyo. The chief dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping over the trembling townsfolk before fixing on Samuel. He spoke in his deep, commanding voice, and Ayoka translated from the porch. "My father say, today he choose, life or death, peace or war." The townsfolk bristled at her words, their fear twisting into anger. "He's threatening us!" one man shouted, cocking his rifle. Samuel's heart lurched. One wrong move and blood would paint the dust. He stepped forward quickly, putting himself between the two sides. "Hold!" he shouted, his voice ringing louder than he thought possible. There's been enough dying on this land. The silence that followed was unbearable. The sheriff's hand hovered over his revolver. The Apache warriors gripped their spears tighter. Even the wind seemed to pause. Samuel turned to the chief, his voice raw. "I didn't take your daughters. I saved them. That's the truth. If you want my life for it, you can take it. But don't drag these folks into it. And don't bring more death to this land." He stood tall, hands open, chest bare to the sun, ready for whatever came next. For a long moment, no one moved. The frontier itself seemed to hold its breath. The chief's eyes narrowed, unreadable. Then slowly he lifted his hand. His warriors lowered their weapons. The townsfolk gasped. Confusion etched on their faces. But Samuel knew this wasn't the end. The chief had yet to speak his decision, and when he did, it would shake both sides to their core. The circle of Apache warriors remained tense, their painted faces like masks carved from stone. The townsfolk, though fewer in number, refused to lower their guns. It was a powder keg, and the spark waited in the silence between heartbeats. Samuel stood in the middle, sweat rolling down his neck, though the air had grown strangely cool. His gaze locked with the Apache chiefs, a silent plea passing between them. End this before blood spills. The chief stepped forward, his eagle feathers swaying in the faint wind. His eyes, dark as midnight, swept across the gathering, first the trembling farmers clutching rifles, then the warriors ready to kill at his command. Finally, his gaze settled on his daughters, standing together on the porch. Nayeli leaned heavily on Ahyoka's shoulder, pale but alive. Her weak smile was enough to crack the iron mask of her father's face. The chief raised his hand. The Apache warriors froze, awaiting his words. His voice rang deep, carrying across the dust-laden air. "My father say," Ahyoka began, translating nervously, "A man's heart is seen in what he does when no one is watching. Samuel Carter, he gave his fire, his food, his strength. For those who are not his blood, he asked for nothing. He gave all." The chief's gaze sharpened on Samuel, testing him, weighing his soul. Then he spoke again, and Ahyoka's voice cracked as she repeated the words, My father say, if he wished to kill Samuel Carter, he would do it now. But instead, he choose to honor him. Gasps erupted from both sides. The townsfolk looked at one another in disbelief, and the warriors murmured their surprise clear. Sheriff Randall shifted uneasily in his saddle, lowering his rifle ever so slightly. The chief turned, speaking in Apache to his warriors. His words rolled like thunder, heavy and absolute. Ayoka translated in fragments, struggling to keep pace. He say, there will be no war. No raid, no blood. He say, Samuel Carter is now kin, brother to the Apache. Protector of his daughters. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't expected gratitude, certainly not kinship. He had been ready to lay down his life, not gain a family, but the reaction was far from relief for everyone. The townsfolk muttered angrily, some lowering their guns, but others keeping their fingers tight on the trigger. One man spat into the dirt. You hear that? He's one of them now. Can't trust a man who sides with savages. The sheriff raised his hand, silencing the crowd. His face was hard, his jaw clenched. Sam, you've put us all in a tight spot. You know this ain't gonna sit easy with folks. Samuel met his eyes, calm but unflinching. I didn't do it to sit easy with anyone. I did it because it was right. The chief, as if sensing the tension, stepped closer and laid a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder. His presence was commanding, undeniable. In that touch was a declaration louder than words. This man is under my protection. The warriors lowered their weapons completely. The tension eased like a bowstring released, though the townsfolk still looked restless, shifting uneasily in their saddles. Then the chief spoke one last time, his voice softer but filled with weight. Ayoka translated, he say, from this day, the blood of his daughters is tied with yours. If harm comes to you, it is the same as harm to them, and if harm comes to them, it will be answered. The words hung in the air like a brand seared into the earth, a pact, a warning, a bond that could never be broken. Samuel felt the enormity of it settle in his chest. He was no longer just a struggling rancher trying to survive the land. By saving 2 lives, he had stepped into a role he never asked for, but one he could not refuse. The chief mounted his horse again, raising his hand in final command. The warriors pulled back, their hooves pounding away into the horizon. Samuel stood in the dust, the eyes of the town fixed on him, the sisters behind him, and the weight of a new life, pressing down like the sun overhead. The shocking decision had been made. But what it would cost him, or what it would grant him, was still unknown. The dust slowly settled. After the Apache warriors disappeared into the horizon, the land, which only moments before had quivered with the threat of bloodshed, now seemed strangely calm. But that calm carried a heavy weight, one that rested squarely on Samuel Carter's shoulders. The townsfolk lingered, shifting uneasily in their saddles. Their eyes darted between Samuel and the fading trail of the Apache riders. Some looked relieved that there hadn't been a massacre. Others looked angry, betrayed, as if Samuel's act of compassion had placed the entire settlement at risk. Sheriff Randall remained still, his horse snorting under him. Finally, he tipped his hat forward, his jaw tight. You always had a stubborn streak, Sam. Maybe it saved you today. But folks'll talk. You'll have enemies in your own town now. Samuel met his gaze steadily. Let them talk. I'll live with it. The sheriff studied him for a moment longer, then wheeled his horse around. The rest of the townsfolk followed, muttering amongst themselves. Their silhouettes shrank in the distance until only silence remained. For the first time since the ordeal began, Samuel exhaled fully. He turned back toward the cabin, where Ayoka stood tall beside Nayeli, her arm bracing her weakened sister. Both sisters' eyes shimmered with relief, gratitude, and something deeper, a recognition of the bond that had been forged through hardship. Ayoka stepped forward, her voice low but firm. My father, he does not give words lightly. When he say you are kin, it is forever. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware of the enormity of it all. He had wanted only to do the right thing. Instead, he had been bound into the life of a people he barely understood, carrying the honor and danger that came with it. That evening, the sisters insisted on helping with chores despite Nayeli's weakness. Ayoka carried water from the well, while Samuel repaired a fence post Buck had knocked loose. The air was crisp, scented with sagebrush, and the sky burned red as the sun sank low. For a brief moment, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. As they sat around the fire outside the cabin, Nayeli spoke softly in Apache, her words halting. Ayoka translated, "She say, when you found us, she thought death was already near, but you gave her back life, and for that, she will never forget." Samuel's throat tightened, and he found himself staring into the flames. He didn't know how to respond to such gratitude, so he simply nodded. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. In the days that followed, whispers spread through Dry Creek about Samuel's new alliance. Some neighbors avoided him, others kept a suspicious eye on his ranch. Yet, oddly enough, none dared challenge him directly. The memory of the Apache chief's hand on his shoulder and the implied promise of protection kept even the boldest troublemakers at bay. Meanwhile, Samuel's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. The sisters remained at the ranch until Nayeli regained her strength, and during that time, a quiet rhythm grew between them. Samuel found himself learning fragments of their language, their customs, even their humor. Ayoka teased him when he mispronounced words, and Nayeli laughed, a soft, musical sound that had been absent from his ranch for too long. One night, as stars blanketed the sky, Samuel looked out across the plains and realized something profound. He was no longer alone. His struggles as a poor rancher hadn't disappeared, but now he carried a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just working the land for himself anymore, he was part of something larger. The chief's decision had stunned everyone, including Samuel. But as he watched the sisters smile faintly by the firelight, he understood that sometimes the most shocking decisions are the ones that carve out new beginnings. The frontier was still wild, still dangerous. Trouble would surely come again, from men or from nature itself. But Samuel Carter knew one truth beyond doubt. When it came, he would not face it alone. And for the first time since he'd set foot on that hard, unforgiving land, he felt like he truly belonged.